Hi, and welcome to another dose of virtual vitamin Z. My name's Stephen, and I'm the curator of Humane Education for the Detroit Zoological Society. And today, our topic is animal cognition, and in particular, animal morality, or what is sometimes called wild justice. And to get started, because we're talking about morality, I have some questions about what you would do in certain scenarios. So here's the first scenario. You see a child accidentally knock over another child on a playground. The first child runs off, the one who knocked the other child over, and the second child who was knocked over struggles to get up. What would you do in this situation? Another scenario is you and your friend are both hungry. So you decide to go to a convenience store to buy some snacks. However, when you get to the checkout counter, your friend realizes that they don't have enough money to buy their snacks. What would you do in this situation? And then the third scenario is that you and a classmate or a colleague are working together on a project. When you turn in the project, your classmate or your colleague gets praised for doing a great job, but you don't. What would you do in this scenario? So we'll come back to these scenarios in a little bit, but as I said, today's topic is animal cognition. And if you joined me for the last episode on animal cognition, you know that we talked about animal intelligence. And today we're going to be talking about a different type of cognition, morality, or like I said, something what's called wild justice. And the terms we're going to be using are cognition, morality, cognitive ethology, and the scientific method. So first of all, cognition, here is a fairly complicated definition of it. It's the mental transformation of sensory input into knowledge about the environment and the flexible application of this knowledge. Now, like I said, that's pretty complex, but what that means is it's the ability to take things that we sense with our senses of sight, smell, hearing, and other senses, and then process them in our minds to gain an understanding of the world around us and how we should act in it. And that includes people's behavior. If we sense certain behaviors, cognition is the ability to know what to do in response to them. And so morality is, in that sense, a form of cognition in which we know what behaviors are right and what behaviors are wrong. And this can take the form of showing a sense of compassion, which is a sense of understanding another person's pain and acting to help them. Altruism, or doing things to help others. And fairness, knowing what people might deserve for their actions. So a question then becomes, okay, this is really maybe interesting, but how would we gain a better understanding of animals' moral senses when we can't just ask them? Well, just like cognitive ethology can help us understand animal intelligence, it can also help us understand animal morality. So one way to gain a better understanding is by observing, analyzing, and interpreting animals' behavior. And cognitive ethology is a field that gains a better understanding of animals' moral senses and other cognitive abilities in this way. So let's go back to these scenarios, and I'll explain why I chose these scenarios. So you see a child knock another child over, first child runs off, second child struggles to get up. What would you do? Well, a lot of you might be thinking, well, I would either go and help the child who appears to be injured, or I would maybe go and tell the first child, hey, you can't do that. Even if it was an accident, you should have stopped and tried to help out. Now, these are called moral intuitions. A lot of times we might not even have to think too much. We just kind of know in our bodies what the right thing to do is. The interesting thing is that researchers, animal researchers who observe animals in different settings have found that animals actually do the same things they might think people would do in similar scenarios. So for example, they've seen evidence of compassion in animals by observing, in one case, an elephant who was injured and knocked over by another elephant. A third elephant, first of all, moved the second elephant out of the way to protect the elephant who had been knocked over, and then went over and showed concern by touching the part of the injured elephant's body that was injured and showing behaviors that suggested they were trying to help. So if we saw this in humans, we might say, oh, that's an example of compassion. And so these researchers saw this in elephants, and they hypothesized, could this be compassion too? How about scenario number 2, in which you and a friend are hungry, you go to a store, but your friend can't pay for the food? What would you do? Well, you might say, well, I would pay for their food. You know, they were hungry, I'm able to, I'll pay for their food. And that might also be this kind of intuitive sense of just what's right and wrong. Now, researchers have seen similar things, similar behaviors in animals. So for example, this was a researcher who actually lived with a dog and a cat and just observed their own behavior like we might. And the cat was able to see the dog was a little bit older and blind. And the cat would actually help the dog navigate around obstacles to find food, so that the dog was able to find food. And this is evidence of altruism, the behavior of helping others. So again, if we saw this in humans, we might think, well, that's really altruistic. And so it raises the question, do animals also have this sense of altruism? And then finally, scenario 3, you and a classmate or a colleague are working on a project. When you turn it in, your classmate gets praised for it, but you don't. What would you do, or how would you feel? I know I would feel a little bit disappointed and upset that I didn't get praised for doing the same work. And I might also feel a little bit frustrated with the classmate for not saying, oh, actually, Stephen did this work too. He also deserves praise. And again, researchers have noticed this in animals in the wild, like in capuchin monkeys. When 2 monkeys do the same work but get a different reward, like maybe one gets a higher quality piece of food, the other gets a lower quality piece of food, that monkey who doesn't get the good food gets upset, visibly upset. And if we saw this in humans, we might say, well, clearly this animal or this human doesn't think that's very fair. And so the question is, do animals also have this sense of fairness if we're interpreting their behavior in the same way? So I have a question. What's your reaction to hearing these stories about animals showing senses of compassion, altruism, and fairness? Well, some people's reaction is this. They say, well, these are just anecdotes. An anecdote is a story. They don't prove anything. They don't prove that animals have a sense of compassion, altruism, fairness. And that's true. But if we think about the scientific method, we can realize that there's this saying that another name for an anecdote, the singular form of the word data is an anecdote. So an anecdote or a story is one piece of data. And rather than dismissing that data, what a good scientist would do would be to continue observing and trying to find more and more evidence. So that leads us to the scientific method there are different lists of steps, but I like to think of it as having 6 steps. You make an observation. So for example, you observe one of these behaviors in the wild. You ask a question. The question could be, does an elephant have a sense of compassion? Do elephants have a sense of compassion? And you can form a hypothesis, which is an educated and testable statement. Like, yes, elephants do have compassion. And you'd have to think about, how do you test that? And you could design a study to test that, collect data, and repeat this process. And all of these stories that I shared are part of this book by Mark Bekoff and Jessica Pierce called Wild Justice. That's where I got the other title of this lesson from, The Moral Lives of Animals. And these authors argue that there is enough anecdotal evidence of animals having these moral capabilities that we need to start thinking that they, in fact, do have these capabilities. And they also call for us to continue doing research, to continue building our understandings of animal morality. And so that leads me to today's activity. And if you want to read a brief summary of this book before deciding to check it out from the library, you can check out this article down at the bottom. So our activity today is animal observations. Again, the first step of doing this cognitive ethological research is to make observations about animals. And we might think that that's something that only trained scientists can do, but we all have the ability to make these systematic observations. And by doing this, we'll not only increase our knowledge about animals, but also our reverence for them, and then strengthen our observation skills, critical thinking, and empathy. And the supplies we'll need are just a field notebook to take notes and a pen or a pencil. So the first step here is to choose a group of animals to observe. Now, these could be animals in your neighborhood. These could be animals in your home. Maybe you live with some companion animals. These could be animals at the Detroit Zoo or on Belle Isle. And spend some time observing this group of animals for about 15 minutes or so. And as you observe the group, start writing down any questions you can think of. And that is the second step of the scientific method, asking questions. And after you've written down a question, reflect on how you could answer it. So think of a hypothesis, and then think about how you might test that hypothesis, perhaps through further observation. So to give you an example, as you may know, the Detroit Zoo has 5 different live cams of different animal habitats, including this live cam of the prairie dog habitat that you can access by going to this link. And you could choose to observe prairie dogs by watching this live cam for 15 minutes. And then as you do, you might start asking questions. You might see 2 prairie dogs seem to be fighting and ask the question, what are they fighting over? Or you might observe other interactions and ask different questions. But again, this is the first step in doing this cognitive ethological research. And so by doing this, you can continue building your understanding of animals while also starting to build your empathy for them, the ability to gain a better understanding of what's going on in their minds and how they're experiencing the world. And that leads me back to our Berman Academy for Humane Education here at the DZS, where we have the mission of helping people help animals. And one big way in which we can help people help animals is by helping people build better understandings of how animals experience the world, or increasing their empathy. And I think that this process of learning about the possibility that animals have these moral lives, and then learning how to do the observations and research to further determine and to further build those understandings, is a great way to build empathy. So I hope that you see this activity as a fun opportunity to move in that direction. There are a lot of other ways in which we also build people's empathy, though. So if you're interested in learning more, be sure to visit our website at detroitzoo.org and then click on the link for education lessons to see a lot of different ways in which you can be building your empathy for animals too. Until then, stay safe and have a great day. Bye.